Okay, let's start, yeah? Yeah? Okay, cool. So if you haven't read the book, which I certainly don't expect that you have, it's really worth starting by identifying what we're trying to do. So the book is called Exocapitalism, right? And the exo here, of course, means from without, from the outside, from the exterior. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a general theory of capitalism. And we're doing this through ontology, not through the social sciences. We're proposing capitalism really as a kind of being, a form, a kind of object, an alien in the most literal sense, something that looks and feels like an algorithm, something that could be generalized and applied elsewhere, something that might have come from elsewhere, something that might be actualized or materialized by humans throughout our history, but something that also could have been actualized or materialized differently by other things that aren't humans according to the same undergirding logic. What happens if capitalism is transcendent? What if it could exist without us, even before us, or irrespective of our involvement? What if capitalism is a bundle of formal principles deeply related to abstraction, representation, language, and even mathematics in some way? And maybe it's not any of those things necessarily itself, but maybe it's potentially part of a class that contains those things. Things that we actualize as humans in local and specific ways, but certainly things that feel like they could happen elsewhere. And because of this, capitalism is a very, very deep issue. And there's a lot of people that we love, people like Mark Fisher or Ursula K. Le Guin, who would suggest that the capitalism that we live in is every bit as arbitrary as any other regime of social organization and is therefore exchangeable, perhaps even easily so, that maybe the obstacle for us is to understand the simple arbitrariness of this condition, that we need to give ourselves the mere permission to imagine an alternative, perhaps by looking backwards to the past and recognizing the great diversity of social systems that came before the present moment, maybe even specifically by looking outside of the West. And this brings us to the question of whether or not the question of capitalism is really arbitrary. And so Roberto and I, we really give ourselves the luxury of defining capitalism a little bit differently than most people do. Whereas instead of looking only at industrial scale surplus value extraction and conventional labor exploitation, we have our eyes squarely on the automatic generation of more capital from capital, the Marxian M to M prime equation, money from more money, as the most important bit. And so for us, the response is that a lot of the underlying characteristics of the present can totally be found in the deeper past, looking into the Andean caravan trade, the Parthian Silk Road, the champagne fairs, the cowrie shell trade, and that maybe it's really worth asking ourselves if capitalism is a deeper problem than we might think it is. That imagining ourselves out of it might not just involve rejecting some ideological conditioning, and that it might involve a far deeper cut or sacrifice than we might expect. It seems that the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century BC was already struggling to control the rampant arbitrage practices of salt merchant middlemen. And so, one of the big provocations of the book is that already with language, you can find yourself trapped in the cancerous loops of capitalism, where simply through the process of elevation from a referent into a surplus of representational positions, you might begin a cycle that leads all the way to high-frequency trading. And this isn't to suggest that capitalism is inescapable, but rather that the condition requires much, much better targeting in order for the work of excision to be really productive.
It feels to us that the tools we've developed to make sense of capitalism don't work anymore. Maybe they did work at one point, say when Marx was examining the official British factory inspectors' reports in the 1830s and 1840s. That's the first book of Capital. You might find some of that there. And then maybe capitalism changed, or maybe it died, or permuted into something unrecognizable as capitalism anymore. And to us, that's totally reasonable, a reasonable conclusion to make once your tools have stopped working. But the kind of end date of normal capitalism and the start date of this new special insurgent post-capitalism keep changing. So the question is, when is it? Is it after Fordism? Is it after Bretton Woods? Is it after Reaganomics? Is it after Asian Tigers, .com, the 2008 crisis, Silicon Valley, after BRICS? Which one is it? When does the new capitalism actually start? And this leads to other questions that are related to this question, that are to us very relevant, and we'll try to address them today to some extent. The first one being, is it useful to fragment capitalism into all of this new but quickly obsolete form? The second one being, is it useful to always consider the present moment as a state of exception, a kind of radical departure? And finally, is it really enough to make sense of capitalism by systematizing just one or two of its expressions, which to us implies shrinking it down to its apperception into human experience? And our answer to these questions is no, that doesn't actually work. Instead of splitting capitalism into old industrial classical capitalism, which is the capitalism that makes sense to us, the capitalism that we have tools to understand, and then a sort of new capitalism, call it late stage, end stage, cognitive, algorithmic, financial, speculative, platform, surveillance, techno-capitalism, or even if you want to follow Varoufakis, techno-feudalism. What we really want to do is we want to zoom deep into capitalism and find something that feels essential, that feels germinal and consistent throughout, regardless of the acceleration or intensity with which those underlying essential mechanics might be applied. And what we think is that we found a framework for these essential mechanics, and that this framework has actually been really useful to us. At the very least, it's been helping us to not only cope with capital, but also to anticipate the moves of capital. So today, we're here to talk about one of those mechanics, which is a function or a tendency within capital itself that we call lift. The talk today is all about lift. Now, there are a bunch of other heavy concepts in this book that you might have, come across with, drag, fold, scale, the last mile. But today we want to stick to lift just to keep things tight and clean.
So, if I need to put together an elevator pitch for what we mean by lift, I'd say that lift is the drive that compels capitalism toward abstraction and away from production. But I could double down on this statement by suggesting that not only is capitalism allergic to production, but that capitalism is further allergic to the feedback loop of consumption and production in general, and moreover, that it's allergic to making things, selling things, buying things, distributing things, and organizing things, and further, that it's allergic to any kind of physical media whatsoever, and even more importantly, that it's actively disinterested in sustaining any direct entanglements with physical media in any respect, humans included, period. And I don't mean disinterested or allergic in a psychoanalytical sense, because in exocapitalism, there's no psychoanalytical subject. We're not talking about a ghost. Instead, when I say disinterested or allergic, I mean this strictly in the algorithmic sense, that the cascading self-abstraction away from material conditions isn't just what capitalism does, it's what capitalism is. And the away part of this equation is what we call lift.
The first kind of lift, and the most basic and fundamental one, is what we call tokenization. And that is essentially the lift of a physical good into exchange value, the elevation of a thing into money. This is something that we came to understand from David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which totally smashes the idealized image of barter systems that so many of us link to ancient societies. No, what Graeber says is that there were not economies just based on, hey, I'll give you some eggs and you'll give me some milk in exchange. It didn't work that way. Those systems were always bound to some idea of money. There always existed some prior framework for respective egg-to-milk pricing. And once you have money, once you have exchange value, something interesting happens. An egg becomes more than an egg. It enters into a dynamic, turbulent web of relationships. That egg can become worth more or less, not only in terms of milk, but also in broader and more general terms, based on the size of that monetary system and the things that it contains. The egg lifts, and this is very important, into virtual eggness. It becomes addressable as a point in a coordinate system of exchange value. It becomes an abstraction. And once one monetary system encounters another monetary system, another lift occurs. There needs to exist a larger marketplace of exchange that contains and mediates their mutual relationships. This coin from one currency needs to be exchangeable with that coin from a different currency through that higher level system of exchange that contains them both and modulates their respective exchange values.
And so this gets like super weird and complicated really, really quickly, because you can actually just always invent a new monetary system, right? And like, it's actually really possible that this new invented space that you made up might spontaneously acquire a connection to real value simply through its relationality. So like think about carbon credits as an example of an artificial monetary system built entirely on regulation. So Tesla makes huge piles of money. Literally, hopefully you know this, literally 40% of Tesla's revenue comes from earning carbon credits through its own kind of practices with constructing electric vehicles, which it then resells to automakers who don't comply in this fashion. 40%. I mean, that's crazy, right? I mean, that's real ass money, like for real. And that's carbon credits. Or think about bells from Animal Crossing or gold in Dota 2 or shinies in Pokemon Go, all of which are in-game currency-like objects that collide, I mean, in a crazily turbulent way with fiat money or crypto via auctions on eBay or Facebook Marketplace. Or think about Star Alliance loyalty points, which collide with fiat money through their relationship to MasterCard, intermediary banks and payment processors like Barclays, and other weird token systems like credit card points or miles. And as each of these systems of exchange collide with each other, they merge into higher order marketplaces through which their turbulent, constantly changing exchange rates are necessarily mediated. And something crazy and super interesting happens every time you go up a level. So I want to describe the most fundamental mechanic, I think, in our book. So if you have some amount of one currency that's worth more in one place than it is in another, you can just buy a bunch of that currency where it's cheap and sell it where it's more expensive, right? I mean, you can think about gold, for example. Think about, let's say, the price of gold in London versus Paris is at some different level. Maybe it's cheap in Paris or cheaper in Paris than it would be in London. So buy it in Paris and take it to London, right? And hopefully the cost of moving it there and bringing it back into the market would be less than what you would ultimately incur through this process of just bringing gold back and forth, right? So this is called arbitrage. And it's not only one of the oldest forms of abstract capital accumulation, and the most geographically distributed forms of capital accumulation, it's also by far the largest form of capital accumulation that exists today by volume. That's what makes line go up. But individual markets hate this. They really hate arbitrage. And you could even say that the objective or the kind of ontological function of a market is negentropic. The whole point of a market is to produce a system through which price becomes equilibrated. So in order to do this kind of thing, in order to conduct this kind of arbitrage, you necessarily have to build this matryoshka doll of markets that bring in new artificial relationships to money at each successive scale. So the higher you go, from physical asset to fiat money to DeFi to meta crypto to bundled ETFs to meta derivatives to all kinds of wacky, insane shit, the easier it is to conduct arbitrage. The underlying inconsistencies in price are going to cascade upwards. Things are going to become more volatile, more random, and ultimately more lucrative.
So we discussed tokenization, and we want to discuss a second type of lift. We'll go through different types. Things will get weirder.
It's a lift menagerie.
Yeah. Things will get weirder throughout the next few minutes. The second type of lift is the one that involves a movement from hardware economics to software economics. That is a movement from commodities to services. So here the idea is that you can only extract so much profit from a physical commodity. You need to make it out of stuff. It needs to be formed by people, and it needs to be moved around in space. And all of those operations actually cost money. They can only get so cheap. You can buy, if you want, as many raw materials as you want, but you'll be limited by the amount of raw materials in planet Earth or other planet if you manage to get there. You can enslave labor as much as you like, but you'll be limited by local laws and finally by the reproducibility of your labor force. You can optimize logistics as much as possible, but at the end of the day, there are ports, there are tariffs, bribes, and fuel that need to be paid for. And unfortunately, the price on the commodity you're trying to sell is limited by its conceivable demand. You can only charge that much, and the differential between the cost of the good you've made and the price you're selling it for, what you would call profit margin, is limited. You're kind of stuck with price. You cannot make up a price. Now, for so much theory downstream of Marx, this is the world space of capitalism. Commodities marketplaces operating under extreme price constraints where the only way that profit can be generated is by trying to squeeze your production costs, ultimately, and I guess we would all agree on this, stealing from your workers, right? Now, theory downstream of Marx then interprets capitalism as a social dynamic through which capitalist and worker classes sustain a holy struggle, and against which the worker class is not only subject to exploitation, but also psyop, deep social and psychological engineering that make the terms of exploitation seem reasonable to the working class. We call commodities economics hardware economics. You're dealing with physical things that need to be assembled out of raw materials and moved around the world. You can only make those conditions so cheap before you hit a wall. But software economics are not really like this. Software margins are incredibly supple and elastic. Yes, you need software engineers, but as a software business grows, many of those functions end up being automatic, an important part. Software economics are all about resale. Software businesses lease property that already exists, package it all together with a bit of their own special sauce, and then they sell it back at a significant markup. We argue that most of software engineering labor is not creative labor. It is not even intellectual labor. It's a low overhead maintenance operation that concerns itself principally with the management of integrations between different pre-existing third-party software ecosystems. At scale, the floors on software margins are not driven by the intellectual labor of software engineers or totally fungible front of house or back desk work. They're actually driven by the price of compute, which is ultimately driven by the price of energy. If there is surplus value generated in the software economy, it is not extracted from human labor, qua labor, but from the compute-mediated arbitrage of energy and its distribution. And we argue that energy today still is very, very, very cheap. We will say catastrophically cheap.
So it follows that software can basically have any price. Like, it doesn't matter. The main variable cost component at scale is compute, which is ultimately electricity, ultimately hardware, capital expenditure on the front end. But then at the end of the day, it's electricity, it's energy. And sure, there's going to be some market determined ceiling on how much you can charge for software. You can't actually charge infinite money. But again, like, software profits commonly exceed even 80% over costs. 80%. That's crazy. I mean, think about what it means to charge an 80% upcharge successively on your cost of goods sold. That's nuts. That's like literally fictional relationship to price. It's imaginary. And that's really what gets exocapitalism, as we call it, excited. It's not the profit margin itself. It's not the fact that you're able to charge 80%. It's not actually even that 80%. It's not the profit. It's not even that dollar value. But rather the fact that you have this super fluid and flexible membrane that you can play with when it comes to setting the price of something. More fluidity, more elasticity, more opportunities for arbitrage. So think about NVIDIA, which everyone here obviously knows is the quote-unquote hardware company driving the AI boom. So yeah, what does NVIDIA make? GPUs, right? The processing units that are required to do all that hardcore multivariable calculus in order to make something like GPT-5 work. But NVIDIA doesn't make GPUs, right? NVIDIA resells Taiwanese chips made by TSMC. And so they license some schematics and some designs to TSMC, but they're definitely not a hardware provider in any respect. They're not making those chips. And what's actually interesting is that the thing that NVIDIA is actually providing that's delivering value when it comes to AI is literally, in every respect, actually software. It's CUDA. It's the software framework that has transformed these chips that's, proprietary to NVIDIA, that has turned video cards into something that could be leverageable to do things like generative AI. But that's also not what NVIDIA is actually selling. Instead, like, an absolutely insane, unthinkably enormous 88% of NVIDIA's revenue comes from their data center segment, which, meaning like these giant data centers that are doing compute for AI, right? And that would make a lot of sense for the world's most valuable company if it actually owned and operated data centers. But it doesn't. It provides a licensing, certification, and ultimately a software management layer on top of data centers owned by third-party co-location partners who also aren't running the data centers themselves. They are also software companies who are providing an intermediary data layer to some then contracted out owners of the actual data centers. And what essentially happens is this is a huge scheme for the leasing and disbursement of upstream compute back through NVIDIA out to its partners. NVIDIA doesn't want to touch hardware. They don't even want to touch data centers. They want to resell all of that ugliness, all of that underbelly as and through software. Capitalism lifts away from the production, consumption, and logistics of physical commodities towards the modular, assemblage, licensing, and then renewable capitalization of software. So the next type of lift is from purchase to contract. So something is really getting lifted when you hear as a service, which functionally means a transformation from ownership or possession of a good into a sustained, renewable relationship around contractual access, right? And this has been going on for an extraordinarily long time. It's actually one of the oldest forms of ownership in every respect. And it's especially even more useful when you're dealing with depreciating hardware assets. Like I was just talking to Mo yesterday. Don't buy a car, lease a car, at least for a temporary period of time, especially if you're in Berlin and you don't want to pay for parking, right? You don't buy a jet engine from Rolls-Royce, you lease power by the hour. That's a concept that they've been running for about 70 years. You don't buy a GPU from NVIDIA, you lease GPU hours. You don't buy 1,000 copy machines from Xerox, you enter into a multi-year enterprise long-term relationship where Xerox will administrate your relationship to copy machines. And while this is useful in hardware economics, it's actually even more useful in software economics, where the underlying good isn't depreciating the same way. So if you're in Adobe, obviously this is a house full of very creative-looking people who have engaged with design software. So I'm imagining there's at least some people who at one point owned, or perhaps more likely cracked, Photoshop back in the day. But now it's a little more annoying to do, right? Because Photoshop is not really a thing you run on your computer anymore. Instead, you're leasing contractually access to software that's running on someone else's servers, right? You used to run Photoshop on your own computer. Now you pay Adobe for access to software running on their servers that you access through a browser or an app. And you pretty much know that you're engaging into this type of relationship every time you're actually engaging with software through a web-based browser, right? Through an application, as opposed to some software that you're running locally. And of course, sure, there's a lot of Ableton users, I imagine, in this crowd as well, or maybe Final Cut users. These are really situations where you can actually buy a somewhat unlimited software license. Maybe this is more of a Reaper crowd, I'm not sure. But the transition to AI-driven software means that the time is really running out here, and that even these tools are ultimately going to grow dependencies on models that are going to be run in large third-party data centers for which any software provider not only can, but must pass through cost on a recurring basis. An example of this would be looking at video editing software, maybe Premiere, maybe Final Cut Pro, context where you might move to like an AI-focused video editing software like Runway, for example, or VO. You're no longer running video editing software on your computer, but you're also not running the kind of core mechanics on any servers that Runway is directly contracting out either, right? You're not running on their AWS instances. You're actually running on AI servers that they are leasing out to other AI providers, maybe through AWS Bedrock, something like that. And that it has its own kind of stack of server provision. So necessarily, everyone who's going to serve you generative AI tooling in the future, unless it's going to be limited to compute that you can actually run locally, is going to be passing on multiple layers of cost to you. And they're going to be receiving recurring costs, and therefore they're going to pass on recurring costs to you as well. So instead of a single point charge from a business to a customer, we're lifting into a sustained long-term relationship, which allows very powerfully for a business to represent its finances in a very speculative way. Instead of revenue, think about recurring revenue. It's revenue in the future as amortized into a kind of speculative reflection on the present. And it's actually not about how much money you have in the bank. This is actually a pretty common thing in a lot of startups. Is actually a kind of disinterest in the amount of money you have in the bank, right? You're really thinking about it in terms of run rate. You're thinking about it in terms of burn. You're not actually thinking about the actual amount of capital that's sitting in the actual bank account. But what you're thinking about is how much money is contractually guaranteed to you in the future, which then you can use as leverage for the automatic reciprocal generation of further capital.
The next type of lift that we wanted to introduce today is what we call managerialization, which means the transition of a business from an actual service provider into something that facilitates services handled by other people. This kind of lift is characterized by a movement away from customers or consumers, and here by a customer we refer to someone to whom a good or service arrives as a consumable entity, the kind of termination point of a chain of business relations. Now, reaching the termination point is of course undesirable for exocapitalism, because that is the moment at which the ultimate price of a good becomes most compressed. This is the ceiling, this is the exit point, this is where the matter of value is actually settled. The goal then, if you think about it, is to transform from a business that interfaces directly with consumers, a B2C company, into a business that really only engages with other companies, a B2B company. And ultimately, to move as far away from the 2C link at the end of the B2B chain as you can possibly get. So you would have a B2B to B2B to B2B to B, and at the end would reach you, real people, to C. Now, we were in Oslo a few days ago, and we wanted to discuss some examples from the kind of Scandinavia's, business reality. And we were talking a little bit about Nokia, who used to sell phones back in the days, which is, of course, a B2C company, right? But then they got outcompeted. I'm sure everyone had a black Nokia in the 90s here. Well, maybe I'm old, so maybe not. And then they got outcompeted by other companies who understood that the value was in software. So, iPhone and the Android-based community, for example, and they evolved from a phone maker into a sort of telco, and eventually they became mainly a B2B provider of network infrastructure. An example that might hit a bit closer is Siemens, who was around when Marx was writing already, yeah? And Siemens has been gradually transitioning over the course of its entire life from a utility company to an industrial manufacturer, to an industrial process designer, and eventually to a factory automator, spending the past 50 years transforming the industrial world into what they call digital twins. A digital twin is essentially a one-to-one representation of a physical object in the cloud. Say, if that physical object has a button on it, then that button can be pressed on the cloud. If the object is taking readings of temperature, for example, that reading can be accessed through an API. You can see the value here in terms of automation, where an entirely digitally twinned manufacturing line can be accessed, maintained, and optimized through remote digital interventions alone. But we think that here is where we're all getting fooled. This is not real. This is not what they're trying to do. These are not their intentions. Yes, and we can think of a similar example, for example, with Tesla. These companies are not interested in manufacturing itself. They're not interested in automating manufacturing and driving down the variable costs of production. That's not what is happening here. Siemens is not doubling down on manufacturing. Instead, what they're doing is they're pivoting away from manufacturing. So what is happening to us is that instead of selling hardware to businesses that operate that hardware in a consumer-facing way, the goal is to sell digital twin software to businesses that then in turn sell their manufacturing capacity to other businesses, and then only at the end, these businesses actually sell some hardware.
This is the most depressing YouTube video I've ever seen in my life. I don't recommend watching it. If you aren't able to actually read the text, it's OnlyFans management consulting, and it's offered by Marcus Hustle. So like this is kind of really what we mean when we're talking about managerialization. Like, again, we're moving from B2C, from a business that sells to customers, to businesses that are primarily selling to other businesses. And you can see this kind of managerialization throughout the small business world, and actually very much in the art world as well. But one of the best examples is the OnlyFans exclusive content creator, where the exclusive in exclusive content precisely names a transition from ownership to contractualized leased access. In other words, to pornography as a service. And as the popularity of OnlyFans exploded, especially during the COVID pandemic, many creators found themselves running viable small businesses, but quickly discovering that the money itself was not necessarily in the first-party production of pornographic material, but actually in dedicated OnlyFans management agencies for the heavy lifting of business and marketing tasks. And in turn, this crazy meta management business model has been cascading upwards, coaching OnlyFans managers on how to create and sustain OnlyFans management businesses. And I mean, you open up LinkedIn.com, which I mean, every artist, you all look so cool and arty. Like, everyone should go on LinkedIn.com. It's fucking crazy. It's like amazing. It's like the most inspiring thing. Like, it's really beautiful. I would maybe there's a couple people in this crowd, I think their work is more beautiful than LinkedIn.com, but I think it's like a small percentage. So you can see this kind of sprawl really in real time. Instead of operating a small business, which is actually really risky, create a generalized management service for small businesses. I recommend it. Like, this is a good thing to do. And then moreover, once you're done with that, create a management service for management services of small businesses, and then create a coaching service for management managers. And then when you're ready to retire, create an executive coaching business to coach those coaches and so on.
It's not a joke.
Yeah, no, it's like really serious. Yeah, thanks, Mo. The next type of lift is from transaction to integration, meaning from a point of sale to a relationship of give and take. And so here's where things start to get really weird. I mean, it's really just going to get weirder from here. So let's talk about Shopify. Hopefully you're all familiar with Shopify. It's one of the weirdest businesses that exists. But if you want an example from elsewhere in the world, you can think about Rakuten, for example, in Japan. These aren't real retailers. They're not malls. They don't buy inventory. They don't own warehouses. They're brokers. And yes, they're platforms. They provide management layers for identity, for payments, for catalog, checkout, and ultimately for an enormous integrated partner app ecosystem. And then they're going to take a cut of the revenue that's flowing through and circulating within that system. And so again, looking at a very up-to-date looking crowd here, I'm sure a lot of you have heard the term platform capitalism. And I have a lot of respect, obviously, for the people who came up with that term. But I think there's a kind of consensus. Everyone's talking about platform capitalism. There's a consensus, especially within left-adjacent and media-centered critique, that the way to understand the world right now is through platforms, and that platforms are obsessed with consumers. Platforms are consumer-facing. Their function is to engage in social engineering to trap consumers for network effect, ad revenue, and external data centers. And it's an obsession. It's really, really deep into the customer side of things, that you can think about platforms as obsessive with respect to their customer base. That's the platform capitalism reading. And to us, like, this kind of is a little bit of a problem because it's coming from a discourse that's really, for the most part, only really thinking about social media, which is actually comparatively such a small part of the platform world. And for someone like Yanis Varoufakis, it's even more extreme. For people talking about quote-unquote techno-feudalism, these platforms are actively evolving into micro-political environments. They're so obsessed, so invested in consumers, that they're literally intervening in their lives. They're vertically integrating into full-stack providers and sustainers of human welfare. But that seems wrong, or that seems like really misdirected. I mean, Shopify gets paid precisely when customers leave the platform. Platforms aren't vertically integrated worlds. They're actually extremely porous. For us, a platform is all about integration. It's about being incomplete. It's about what we call surface area that creates opportunities for other businesses to come in and nest themselves. It's about partnerships, channels, and alliances through which a given platform provides as many management solutions as it is receptive to them. It's about fertility. Platforms are incredibly horny.
Now, this is not dissimilar at all to China's huge WeChat platform, which contains actually 20 million integrated micro applications.
20 million. That's crazy. 20 million businesses integrating with WeChat.
That operate like pores or like backrooms within the WeChat project. A techno-feudalist, if you want, would suggest that WeChat is actively invested in managing services like transportation, for example, vertically integrating itself into the physical lives of its users in order to maximally extract from their attention. But we argue that this is not actually what is happening. Right? Instead, what WeChat does is it partners with Didi, for example, to offer taxi services within a user interface that at the end of the day looks identical to Didi's native application, just served up within the raw interface of WeChat. And then WeChat collects a cut both from Didi and through its parallel partnerships within the Chinese state. Now, to us, not only that, WeChat also operates as a kind of hinge around the Great Firewall, capitalizing on its relationship with the Chinese state through its dual mechanism, which is the WeChat Weixin divide. Weixin was created in 2011. A couple of years later, China realized that there is a wall out there that they can capitalize on. Then WeChat became a reality. And what WeChat does to us is it provides its customers outside of China with a heavily moderated backdoor into the Chinese internet, monetizing governance and regulatory complexity, arbitraging sovereignty itself.
If you haven't, I'm just going to say, if you haven't used WeChat, you have to look at it. Like, it is really the most exo thing that's ever existed. It's crazy. It's amazing.
It is quite impressive, yeah. Now, so far we've discussed examples that relate to, contemporary companies that you may all know and so on. But we also want to look back with some of the examples that we are discussing today. And one of the arguments that we want to make, for example, is that WeChat looks a lot like the champagne fairs of the 12th to 14th centuries. The counts of Champagne built a B2B management layer, and they took tolls, rents, court fees, and exchange fees. Now, these were not just platforms, they were actual lifted economic zones, mediating identity, payments, fulfillment, all through a sprawling partner ecosystem of Lombard bankers, notaries, carders, and so on. This platform was incomplete and it was porous. It was a protocol to let the Genovese, the Flemish, the English, and the Catalan networks plug in and trade through it.
This is my favorite graph of all time. So the most advanced practitioners of Lyft are able to operate at just incredibly stunning removes from the actual surface of transactions. Like if you think about the relationship between Delta Airlines and American Express, this is not a relationship of a business to a customer or a business to a business. It's a kind of muddy commingling of two worlds, two platforms through which revenue moves in eddies and streams. They're not the same company. They don't want to be the same company. In fact, the value itself occurs precisely from the fact that these are two different companies. Neither wants to be a monopoly as such that governs the entire world within itself. Instead, both want to be translucent films that cling to each other, that rub and flow together. And this is the contemporary monopoly, an omnivorous monopoly. And this is something that I think so few people understand. It's not about controlling a world or a market, but rather being open for integration with everyone and everything, to have infinite surface area, such that even if two companies might compete, like Oracle and Microsoft, they're also totally flowing into each other, over each other, excreting and drinking revenue through each other. And just a comment on the slide, sure, it's really reasonable to think of a company like OpenAI as the company that's giving you ChatGPT, right? That's what OpenAI conceivably is. But the company itself, I think very rightfully, considers ChatGPT to be a freemium marketing tool for its core business. Large-scale, multi-year enterprise partnerships wherein this or that company it's working with is going to build AI agents at scale within OpenAI. But even that doesn't seem right. Even that is superficial. Even that product is a marketing tool because OpenAI obviously is functioning more like a securitization tool through which large speculative capital raises with valuations that are based on AI hype produced through those marketing operations can then be absorbed into other organizations within the broader Oracle, Microsoft, NeoCloud, lugubrious GUI space. And to give you some sense of how large these operations are, I'm sure, we've all criticized OpenAI for its $200 million deal with the US military, which sucks. I mean, the US military, right? In every respect, the US military. But 200 million is 0.5% of the capital raised by OpenAI this year and 0.06% of its vendor contract with Oracle. Could that not also be a marketing tactic?
So let us keep moving through Lyft. From here, there's that lift from product to position. This is the moment where business stops making money on things and they start making money on stakes. And this is the moment where a business, and I'm sure you've seen this, becomes a bank. So one of the examples that we wanted to discuss, this is SoftBank, a Japanese company, which began as a kind of software license manager and distributor. They used to sell magazines with floppy disks attached back in the days, in the 90s, where floppy disks were a thing. And they leveraged that weird floppy disk company to borrow cash, and then they used that cash to finance speculative bets on other companies, essentially arbitraging the asymmetry between American software business valuations and the respective valuations in Japan. Now, this hit a local peak when SoftBank bet 20 million USD on Alibaba in the year 2000. By the year 2014, that had become 50 billion USD, and they continue to place bets like these, at the end of the day becoming a broker for the purchase and sale of other companies. And if you think about it, almost every hallmark logo of conventional industrial capitalism went through the same transition. From Berkshire Hathaway's mid-century transition from textile milling to an insurance-powered capital float allocator, and then eventually into an ambiguous multinational holding company, or the Hudson-based company's early 20th century transition from fur trading to real estate management, or from the 19th century maturation of US Standard Oil from refining into an ambiguous trust certificate management machine, or if you want to look backwards, on the 15th and 16th century, the Medici state transition from cloth to a multinational financial services kind of business. In each of these cases, the underlying good, and this is very important, became less and less relevant to the underlying source of value, given its proportionally limiting returns, scaling instead through the abstraction of the product, the reinvestment of capital into itself, and the establishment of reciprocal relationships within the broader plane of business as such. Now, this was actually, and we are trying to look back here, I'm trying to make that effort, a really, really common practice before the heyday of industrial capitalism. And another classic kind of 18th century example of this would be the South Sea Company. After the Spanish War of Succession, the British government had incurred a ton of war debt and issued a ton of IOUs to the providers it owed money to. As part of the treaty that ended that war, the British government obtained a valuable license it could exploit to pay off that debt. The permission to trade, and this is up, enslaved African people to Spanish colonies. The British government proposed a relationship with the newly founded South Sea Company, where anyone with an IOU to the government could exchange that IOU for equity in the South Sea Company, who was going to be the company who would engage in British transatlantic slave trade. But the funny thing is the South Sea Companies did not own any boats, it had no destinations, it didn't have anything. It was literally just a title on an idea, a really f***ed up idea. Now, those IOUs floated in, and the South Sea Company became huge overnight. Not only that, they could reference the equity they had raised in order to sell new shares to pull in more money, essentially riding the financial volatility of their own stock, at the end of the day, ballooning, popping, and flatlining before they even actually set sail.
It's worth noting that Isaac Newton took a huge bet on slavery. By the way, this is not how you invest in the stock market, just to let you know. But, you know, okay, so you could also think about Starbucks. We were just having a great conversation about Starbucks. So Starbucks forces its customers who want to use the app, which is increasingly, at least in the US, like almost required to do anything at Starbucks at this particular point in time. And you have to put a certain like blocks of money at a time. It's usually around 25 USD. And these are called stars, which is really beautiful because in some very real sense, they're also bucks, which I really like. So essentially, you're lending money to Starbucks, right, in advance of receiving any coffee. And as of earlier this year, Starbucks was sitting on almost 2 billion USD in stored value balances from customers. That makes them within the top 25% of biggest banks in the United States. So hell yeah. This float is interest-free capital. So they're actually a really good bank that can happily reinvest that cash in any way. They could use it for operations until someone redeems it, and actually quite a few customers never redeem it. And unlike a traditional bank, Starbucks isn't obligated to pay any interest to any customers for anything, right? And it's also worth saying that Starbucks is also managerially lifted through licensing. So 48% of Starbucks stores aren't managed by Starbucks, but are licensed to third parties. You know this every time you've gone into like some kind of shitty shopping mall grocery store hybrid and you see something that looks like a Starbucks there. It might be more of an American experience, but that's a lot in the UK. And so these licensed stores, they're generating these stars, they're generating reward points, royalties, and margin on the Starbucks applied product and brand, but they're keeping CapEx and operating costs with the partner. So Starbucks is monetizing the brand, they're monetizing software, which is the software that's required to turn these third-party things into Starbucks's, and also recipes, equipment, IP, raw supply for the meta layer. So like the question is Starbucks a coffee company? And like, absolutely, right? It's totally a coffee company. Like coffee is definitely involved. It's definitely connected to revenue. It's at least in their current forecasting, actually going to be increasingly connected to revenue in some sense. But is it in its particularity determinative of revenue? Because Starbucks is also a software company, in fact, an enormous software company, and it's also a bank, and a very, very big bank. And in fact, the only part of the business that is struggling, the part of the business that has seen 4 years of revenue atrophy, is the coffee business, which it is urgently attempting to dissociate itself with. If a business makes more and more of its money from being a bank, then the question is, what kind of labor is relevant here? Is it the barista labor? Is it the labor of offshore third-party growers? Or is it something else? What kind of labor is important here? What kind of labor power is important here? And that's the problem. Because the more friction that is applied by this or that so-called material dependency, the more the business attempts to retreat into higher and more generalized abstraction layers that contain more possibilities for alternative dependency paths.
When we talk about the supply chain, it's easy to imagine the supply chain as a kind of long, single-link vertical chain. But that's not the case. It is instead a deeply interlinked array of lifting objects, each of which have secured multiple redundancies in terms of the downstream and upstream dependencies. A procurement agency can always automatically reroute to a cheaper or less problematic producer. The actual contents of the supply matter less and less in their particularities, and they certainly are not distinct or individual in any way in their ultimate relationship to revenue. Instead, they're fungible. They're interchangeable abstract vectors. But this gets so much more intense when we understand this through the principle of lift, because not only does a produced good not matter in terms of its particularity, but the connection between produced good and revenue itself is rapidly unspooling, as each successive element of a supply chain also undergoes its own recursive nested lift. As you lift, you find yourself participating not in a commodities economy, but an economy of stakes, an economy of alliances, an economy of speculation, all of which are not only removed from the commodities economy, but are actually increasingly self-sufficient, in that they capitalize purely on what Marx called fictitious capital, but to us, the only real type of capital, which is arbitrage.
And just to be clear here, like looking at the diagram, if you can see it, like you can see these lower networks, which are suppliers and ultimately like distributors and things like that. And it's worth knowing through someone like Mackenzie Wark that increasingly it's really easy to just treat each of these lines like vectors. But what we're adding here is that each of these businesses at each of these levels of supply is also going through lift at the same time. So each of these, let's say, component manufacturer, they're turning into brokers, and distributors are turning into procurement marketplaces. So you have this shepherd tone of lift moving through both sides of the distribution chain. Okay, so now we're almost at the end here. So hopefully you guys are still got some energy. The final kind of lift for now is from asset-based arbitrage to purely stochastic arbitrage. So Citadel, a giant hedge fund who has lifted from being something like a bank, being a financial services company, to being essentially a fully automatic money machine. Citadel Securities uses advanced algorithms to trade stocks, options, and other assets at incredible speeds, often holding positions for 200 milliseconds or less. And the logic driving these trades is not concerned with the long-term prospects of companies. They don't give a if they invest in IBM, they don't care if IBM is going to do good because they're out 200 milliseconds later, right? They're literally only interested in the tiny discrepancies in price, which tend to be very random, in patterns in order flows and other statistical opportunities. So really, you can think about it as like harnessing randomness or random-like behavior as a source of profit, engaging in complex multi-legged arbitrage across the whole market, derivatives, futures, stocks, sometimes just on purely statistical grounds. And you can think of it like the first way is like, let's say you have two different stocks or options that you're looking at. And let's say you've established a correlation historically that if one stock goes up and the other stock goes down, that maybe if you start to see one stock go down, you can bet on the stock that's going up, right? That's a very kind of superficial way to think about it, but that kind of correlation is real. So that might be one way to do it. Another way to do it would be something like, let's take a ton of market data, maybe associated with a cluster of assets. Let's train a machine learning model to get a sense of how it actually moves. And then from there, look for certain patterns. And then, an algorithm will quickly cut in and out based on how those patterns look. But the problem is that even this is too predictable. Even this is too grounded in the actual asset itself, because these fluctuations in value, like if Citadel is tracking them, looking at like two connected assets, then you know that everyone else is tracking them too. And so if they start to track them, if they start to place bets at the same time, ultimately what happens through a market is you get a kind of equilibration, you get a compression, so no one actually gets to make any money. And what's actually extremely cool, and the next kind of step of solution to this was to use maybe the most poetic term in all of finance, dark pools. Have you heard of dark pools? I mean, my God, these people are just real artists, you know? So a dark pool is basically you place in a box a concatenated chain of hundreds of different bets, very, very small bets on different positions. You put them in a box, and then you execute them all back and forth, and then reap the result, so that no one even gets a sense that you would touch the market in this way. And you're also kind of disguising the moves that you made by making, you know, this or that bet in other parts of the market. And so that's one way to do it. But actually, a better approach is to just use math, man. Just use straight ahead stochastics to look at a totally decontextualized graph and make an inference based on the inherent patterns in this particular kind of randomness. And randomness seems very random, but it's also, randomness is actually quite predictable at small scales. Like, you can actually really get a sense of how randomness might perform. That's what the entire field of stochastics in mathematics is all about, which is about modeling the inherent turbulence within randomness. And so when doing this kind of thing, Citadel doesn't care what the underlying asset is. They might not even know what the underlying asset is. Actually, almost certainly they don't know what the underlying asset is. The content of these trades is irrelevant. They're generating profit because of the market's continuous fluctuations that are providing endless opportunities for quick in and out. And if you trade thousands of times per second, even tiny statistical edges, 51% chances, I mean, that's way better than casino odds. That's going to yield some kind of profit. Or if the market is plummeting, well, that's fine too, baby. Just take a short position, right? Just place a put. Like, it doesn't matter how the market moves. It matters that the market moves. And everything underneath it, the machines, the human sweat, the blood stolen through colonial violence, the service workers whose passports have been taken away, the pharmacy workers, the software engineers, the HR managers, the humming GPUs enhanced by slave-extracted neodymium, all of it bubbles up to the level of a random number generator against which bets can be made simply through statistical inference.
So yes, this is where Exocapitalism starts as a theoretical project with arbitrage as the kernel of capitalism, with the idea that corporate interest tends towards the liquid, the recurring, the independent, the recursive, the elastic, the fictitious, and in so doing it tends away from the soil, from the land, from the blood, from the sweat. Now, this is not to say that the soil, land, blood, and sweat are not real. They are real. This is not to say that they don't matter per se, but rather that they only matter insofar as they consist in the actualization of a formal logic that can exist irrespective of that actualization itself, much like how computation can exist without compute, or how language or mathematics to us can exist without a human socius. If capitalism has its own independent formal logic, then looking at it only through its downstream actualization doesn't do the trick. It doesn't sufficiently explain our world. It's the wrong way to go about understanding what's actually going on. And that's why we keep getting theories that conclude that capitalism has entered this or that new phase. Now, there's a calcification, we argue, of liberal and even leftist thought around a strictly social critique of capitalism, a commodities-driven critique of capitalism, a kind, if you want, of evangelical literalism of exegetic Marxian text, where actually the only way to understand anything is its material conditions at the smallest possible scales. And ultimately, if capitalism is potentially pre-built into something like abstraction, representation, language, or even thought, what actual opportunities exist to contain, neutralize, or intentionally mobilize its excesses? This is not to suggest that this problem is inescapable. And here is where we are excited about the responses to the book. Now, I'm sure that if some of you have read it, you will argue that we do not provide a solution here. We believe that's not our task, that's not what we want to do. But over the past weeks and days, we've been talking to different people that have suggested possible approaches. Only a few days ago, we were in Oslo talking to Ruben Steinheim and Cornelia Remo-Klok, and they suggested that the issue might be crafting the appropriate sigil for capitalism, that is to call it by its right name and protect ourselves accordingly, identifying it properly, let's put it that way. We were talking to Mo Salemi and then to Simon Denny, who are here both tonight. That's a luxury. And they both suggested that there might be some opportunity to write these conscious flows in really intentional ways. Some others have even suggested reframing Marx's labor theory of value into one around volatility and volatility production instead of surplus value addition. Others have invoked a history of anarchist analysis, suggesting that the focus should be on small-scale social autonomy and self-sufficiency. Hito, for example, Hito Sterol, suggested that maybe one has to become utterly pre-linguistic, thoughtless, almost egg-like. And a few weeks ago, also, we were talking to Max Valencia, who is a follower of Nick Land. He really knows his work, and he will suggest a much more violent solution to all of this through the application of extreme social controls. But regardless, we're excited by the prospect of taking the question of escapability extremely seriously and examining the question through its most likely scenarios.
So finishing up here, we don't want to be misunderstood, that we're somehow suggesting that capitalism is necessarily good, though we are quite indifferent. But here's where people get really stuck, I think. The calcified liberal or even leftist position that we're kind of talking about, it loves to engage in superficial moral conflict between absolute good and absolute bad, absolute big and absolute small, absolute innocent and absolute corruptive, absolute victim and absolute perpetrator. And the bad, the corruptive, the perpetrator, they tend to collapse into a kind of black hole, a kind of de-differentiated singularity of evil. And we're not making an argument against vilification, but rather for a true polytheistic pantheon, perhaps, of evil. One where different aspects of the liberal or leftist enemy can be understood through avatars with different motivations, different abilities, and different dispositions. And in some respects, we're kind of following from Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, which can be refracted or maybe tortured a bit to the idea that there exists great difference, albeit intersecting difference, within the spectrum of oppressors, just as there is great difference, albeit intersecting difference, in their experiences as oppression. But this book is not about oppression, which I think is what makes it actually a unique contribution to the discourse, but is instead a thought experiment about the internal mechanics of capitalism. And there are thousands of books about oppression and capitalism. We're happy to recommend some. But I will say, if we understand capitalism strictly and only through its capacity to oppress, we limit ourselves to an essentially reactionary position. No. If capitalism is your enemy, you should know your enemy. And you should understand your enemy not only through its tactical advantages on the battlefield, nor through the endless recounting of thousands of lost battles, but really through an honest accounting of its motivations on its own terms. We so passionately believe that the question of escapability must first be met, perhaps by such a beautiful group of people like yourself, taking upon themselves the willingness to understand this otherwise maybe arcane, but maybe just tedious mechanics of the object under discussion by touching the hot stove. We understand that our enemy is most likely scale, that underneath the unspooling, radiant logic of capitalism is the raw reality that humans are, and maybe always have been, reproducing themselves at scale through slavery, and that this particular demon within our demonology should hold primacy within our thoughts. We are in a situation where we already exist at scales that we do not understand, and all that we seem to be able to do is revert to the very same systems of mass enslavement that have been regulating human social reproduction at scale since at least the agricultural revolution. But that's another 2-hour-long lecture. This was 1 hour. Thank you for bearing with us, and thanks for listening to us and for having us.